This is Call the Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Handley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
On today's episode, we answer a listener's question about how to manage romantic feelings for their psychiatrist.
Say you like me, you better count the ways, side to side.
Okay, so on to the question for this episode. Since it's from a specific listener, I have to bring the disclaimer back. We haven't had that for a couple of episodes, so bear with me.
A lot of people like it. Listen, the lawyers are, this is how we get our hooks in the lawyer listener group.
Yeah, right. All right, so this is a podcast.
Turns them on.
Just because you're listening to this podcast does not mean we have a doctor-patient relationship. Our intention is to educate and entertain you. Nothing we say is intended or recommended as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own physician or other qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical questions or conditions. It feels long, but we got through it.
I think it's complete.
All right, we get to move on. Let's go on to our question. So this listener gave us permission to use their initials, but had an understandable desire for confidentiality. So we're going to leave this as an anonymous question. I'm going to read the email, but I did a few edits to the person's message. I took out a reference to a specific number of years, and I took out singular gender pronouns to make it less specific. So any awkwardness in the phrasing is mine and not the listener. So, all right. You ready? It starts with a compliment, so hold on. I discovered your podcast.
I'm sorry. I was like really holding my breath as if I haven't read it before.
Like you had no idea what was going to be said.
You're like, hold on. I'm like, okay, I got it. All right. I'm actually ready. Go ahead, please.
I discovered your podcast looking for Hidden Valley Road reviews. I'd seen so many glowing reviews on the book, but I felt very unsettled after reading it. I was so glad to hear your perspective and know that my intuition wasn't off. So it's very nice.
Indeed.
That was the compliment. Here comes the question.
Okay. Now I'm really braced.
Right. I do also have a question that stemmed from listening to your Boundaries episode. I've been seeing the same psychiatrist therapist, they do both, for many years. The psychiatrist is exceptional in their treatment, always caring and responsive, and boundaries have always been well established. I respect that greatly in our relationship, and I would never want anything else but the healthy therapeutic alliance that we have now. I've had romantic transference feelings from my psychiatrist for a very long time, and although I've addressed it in session from time to time, I'm ashamed, that I carry those thoughts and always downplay them. These thoughts have turned periodically into erotic transference, and at times thinking about this person daily to a degree that I would be embarrassed to admit it. I've heard stories of people getting referred out when erotic transference happens. I don't think that would happen given I'm always able to talk to my psychiatrist and work through issues that occur in my life. However, the fear of it keeps this fact bottled up in sessions. All right, here are the questions. First off, why does idealization and erotic transference happen? Can you give examples when you've had to work through this with patients? Can it be resolved? When would cases be referred out? What kind of steps can a patient take to help reduce these feelings when they become overwhelming? All right. So erotic transference, which whenever I hear that, I've always thought that would make a great name for a punk band or maybe any kind of rock and roll band, like the erotic
any
transference.
kind of band.
Yeah. Or the erotic transferences. That's that mouthful. But if anybody wants that, they can have it. I would like that. I would like that.
Right. You're just pitching it to the general audience.
Right. I have always wanted
just making
it to,
sure.
Yeah, I've always wanted it to be a band name. I'm just saying it's there if anybody wants to take it.
Okay. Very cool.
And then also, this might be an off mic thing, but we're going to have to workshop the title for the episode today because I'm worried using erotic transference in the title, we're going to get flagged by, Apple or some of the AI that we're somehow mature content only or something.
Is there a way to find out ahead of time?
I don't think so. I think it's just going to look bad. So we're going to have to come up with, I'm going to probably use romantic something. Yeah. Which actually, this is a great segue into what is erotic transference and what is the love of Eros. So do you want to take it from there?
Great. I would love to. Okay. So I think we should back up, right? Because this emailer listener has a lot of great questions and great taste in podcasts. And this person has a pretty good vocabulary in terms of transference, different types of transference. But, we should start by talking about what is transference. I think generally speaking, we could describe transference as unconscious feelings transposed onto another person. Some people, I think, will pretend that transference only happens in therapy. I would say that transference happens all the time, that it is more a specific function of therapy that it's talked about or talked about explicitly in a psychodynamic therapy, which is the disclaimer we're always making. And that, there's some old joke that maybe is not that funny, but that's like the gift of transference is that you never have to meet a stranger, right? That you put, or a person, all of us, put our expectations on to other people as we meet them in terms of how we anticipate they're going to act or react to us. Dave, do you want to add anything to this intro definition?
No, that was
before we
complete.
talk about the romantic and erotic ones? Thank you.
No, that was complete. And we touched on this a little bit in the last episode around boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so no, I think that was complete. And now we get to talk about this very specific kind of relationship or this specific feeling.
Yeah, and we had talked about boundaries in that episode, and boundaries are important and definitely an important part, I think, of this discussion of erotic or romantic transference. But I think, one way to speak to, I think, the core of this person's question is to recognize that therapy is intimate, right? Transferences happen and erotic transferences happen. And having these feelings in and of itself does not constitute any sort of problem with boundaries, right? Having them, expressing them, at least from the patient's point of view, can be an integral part of therapy. And some theorists even would say that an analysis or a complete psychodynamic therapy is not complete unless erotic transferences have been explored. This idea has been around for a very long time. Since Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, but his thoughts and theories about this evolved a lot over time, both with Breuer, who he witnessed Breuer's treatment of Anna O, which is a famous case, and she fell in love with him. Freud at first thought that this wasn't really possible, that he thought it had something to do with the therapist himself rather than kind of a predictable or commonplace interaction. That's not to say that it's not super intense or difficult for people. And then, of course, there's always Jung, who also experienced these erotic transferences. And then I would say his own powerful countertransferences, which would be the therapist's reactions to the patient's transference. And he actually slept with at least one of his patients famously. And Freud got to know about that case very well after she left Jung to go to Freud. So, there's many details of this, but I think I guess maybe the take-home point is that since the beginning of psychotherapy, this has been an issue, though some of the thinking around it has evolved, as we understand more.
Thankfully.
I think, thankfully, thank God. Right?
Incredibly sexist and everything. And when you read that literature, I just wanted to interject for a second too, that I wanted the listener to know as well that that this is common. It's often uncomfortable to talk about. Not only from the perspective of the patient, but I think even psychiatrists don't particularly like to talk about it amongst themselves because, first of all, there's this assumption or there's this possibility that you might be viewed as someone who facilitated that type of transference. Or you can just come across as arrogant and self-absorbed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, including that, some of this shame can have multiple roots, but in keeping with what you're saying right now, part of the reason is I think most of the time when we talk about erotic transference, it's when the therapist is assumed to have mismanaged that, right? That there is a boundary crossing, that there is a physical or romantic or sexual relationship between the patient and the therapist that is inappropriate and exploitative. And so, the times when we do talk about it is when it's gone wildly out of hand and hurt the patient, right? And that I think is maybe more in the general public than even amongst therapists. But I think you're right that it gets tricky, kind of no matter who's discussing it. However, we will talk, or hopefully later we will address with this writer, this question asker, I don't know what we want to call them, maybe the pros and cons or ways to approach bringing it up. But I think generally speaking, there are good arguments for understanding erotic transference, which means you have to talk about it, right? At the very least, I think it's an important way to communicate about how the person is feeling. It may be a way to communicate about their early life and past experiences. And it can mean a lot of different things that, we can go more into, including issues that aren't exactly about sex, right? I mean, how often, even in real life, is sex just about sex? It can be about, power and intimacy. It can be about equality. It can be romantic. It can be part of an admiration kind of thing. There's just a lot of ways it can take shape. And so I think brushing it to the side, either deciding that it's not worth it or it's too dangerous, or even just in a categorical way, kind of thinking, well, this just means one thing. And, every patient, especially, you're right, if we want to be sexist, every female patient falls in love with their male therapist. And that's just how it goes, right? I don't know. This may be an off mic thing, but I had a supervisor once that informed me at the beginning of supervision, which some supervisors can take to be more therapeutic than supervisory, that we were at really high risk because he was a powerful man and I was a young admiring woman, and we needed to watch for erotic transference.
That's what I mean, is like the arrogance
I
throughout the
know.
literature and in practice. There's this one guy that was at our program, who's a well-known psychologist. When I joined the faculty, we were in different departments, but I had this one clinical intersection, and God, he was so inappropriate. I mean, he honestly believed that every woman he met had this erotic transference, like within minutes. I was simultaneously embarrassed for him and enraged on behalf of my patient.
I mean, I also, to be clear, started crying in response to this pre-interpretation of our work together, which, did not do a lot to dispel the myth that I'm hysterical. So like
you were already in love. Like, oh my God.
I was already in love. I was already upset that he had, punctured the hole in my transferential fantasy.
Oh.
Right. Or he was just displaying his narcissism that was so impenetrable. I knew from the beginning that there was nothing I could do to defend myself. It was horrifying.
So your tears were of just helplessness?
It was frustration. Yeah, like pure frustration. Like, I have been pigeonholed and I understand there is no way out of this. We had not even had a conversation.
Wow.
It was like, demographically, this is who you are. Demographically, this is who I am.
Right.
And this is what we've got to watch out for.
And you're going to love my power.
I mean... he did in that way, he prevented it. It turned straight to disgust and rage. I mean, we skipped right over it. So efficient.
And to bring Freud back in, I mean, that was his, I think, towards the end, he was like, oh, this is all about this woman's attempt to neutralize the power dynamic. She's trying to usurp my authority by coming on to me, basically.
Right. Which again, I think could be a function, but it's not the only function. Right. And so, so, I mean, let's talk about possible functions of this kind of transference, right? Including the caveat that it's always more than one thing, right? Like, these are all categories that are going to be overly simplified, and that this is a multi-layered thing that could also just shift from time to time, right? I mean, I think Freud's initial idea before he got to that later is that this is all just reenactment of someone's early life, their impulses, their fantasies, and that he could interpret that directly or name it, which again, overly simplified. There's a few other ideas that I think still have some support today, including just the idea of using the erotic transference as a resistance, right? I mean, this is kind of about control, but it can hijack the situation. It can be uncomfortable and focus pulling for the therapist. And that it can also just be a protection against remembering actual painful experiences or preventing the therapist and the patient together going down a painful road. And maybe it's too late to back up, but I also want to say that most of the time these functions are unconscious, right? The patient is reporting how they feel. And, this is when I talk about the function, it's sort of like what would be the underlying drivers of why, someone would have this kind of transference and bring it into the treatment. Another, which is maybe a gentler take on that power dynamic, is just that it's equalizing, right? That as much as we try to be more egalitarian as modern therapists and be in a partnership with patients, which I really do believe in, I think oftentimes the doctor or the therapist is still seen as an authority figure or the person of competence, the person who is being asked for help, and that there is a hierarchy implicit in that. And that, there's a way of attaining parity by putting you on the same field as adults that could be attracted to each other, a way to have equal power. There's some good case studies and some theorists that would talk about erotic transference kind of coming to light after a severe empathic failure, right? So if the therapist really fails the patient, fails to connect, that may be a way that the patient, again, unconsciously or subconsciously attempts to reestablish a loving connection of some sort. Sounds like you have criticisms of this, Dave, but there is a possibility that power dynamics are at play here. As you alluded to, it could undermine the doctor's authority, maybe especially in the older, more overtly misogynistic days, a way of a woman taking power over a man. The patient could feel more powerful. But then I think it also can be a way to test the power dynamics, right? If someone has a history of trauma trauma, I would say sexual trauma, or not even sexual trauma, but just intrusive early caregivers or early life, I think that there can be a test there that, if and when the therapist doesn't give in, or that the patient can't force a therapist to cross the boundary, that there's safety in knowing that even though my father seduced me, I can't seduce my therapist. I think that those are the main categories of functions, but I don't know if you have other thoughts or there are things in there you want to push back against more.
No, I don't have anything. And I don't even have a particular criticism around the power dynamic change. I think I've even felt that before in that relationship. So no, I don't. I was being more flippant about. Sometimes it's just difficult to read through some of those writings.
It's really difficult, right? I mean,
from a modern lens, yeah, and trying to
sure.
take the nuggets that you can without being sucked into the ridiculousness of some of the behavior.
Absolutely. I would like to say a little bit more about the why. I think there is an intimacy in therapy that is often very unique as compared to the patient's other relationships or previous relationships. Sometimes, again, if we buy at all into the fact that the therapist is something of an authority figure, or at least someone to be, from whom help can be sought, maybe the therapist is the first competent, caring adult or authority type figure that's been in that person's life, right? I mean, to be seen and appreciated that way, I think is extremely powerful. And that, when two people are in this type of intimate relationship, I think it's more than understandable, even, without it meaning that there's something terrible about the patient's history, to say that, that the patient might think of other ways to be close to that person, right? To have fantasies about spending more time with them, being more intimate with them, being their one and only, right? All things that, many of us have fantasized about with parents or partners or loved ones, that there's something exhilarating and scary and stimulating, quite frankly, about being that close with another person.
Well, here's my really shrinky answer to the why, which is this is why the listener has to resolve the transference with the therapist so that this listener can understand the why for him or herself. Right?
Well, Dr. Shrink, David Hanley, I think you're onto something. I mean, I'm not, yeah, I think you know what's up.
Right. I mean,
I think that's why.
I don't know. We can't say the why for you, but you understanding your why is part of your therapy. And that's why it's so important that, and I will say from the question stem, this sounds like a really good therapy that's going on. The two of them have talked about it already. It's been in the room. They've acknowledged it. It's not unconscious anymore. And so really taking it to the next step, I would say, is a really healthy direction for the therapy. When I say the direction, I don't mean acting on it. I mean exploring it.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, in the description, this therapist sounds more than competent and pretty amazing. You know, but and it sounds like maybe the primary thing that hasn't been spoken is how deep and persistent and maybe how eroticized, which I'm taking to mean sexualized, their feelings for the therapist have become.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I hate the fact. Yeah. So there's the erotic transference and there's the eroticized transfer. Like, could they not have come up with a slightly different name, like something?
I mean, you maybe have not read as much psychoanalytic literature, but these people love to trip over themselves with words. I mean, could object be a more awkward translation? It's like you even get to translate, you get to make up the words and pick them. Right. And we still can't get out of our own way. It's bananas. When people are talking about eroticized, the underpinning of that is that it's egosyntonic, meaning that the person actively wants and believes that they could have a romantic relationship with the therapist, or that's still the desirable outcome. Whereas, you know, this person who wrote in is saying, we have this great relationship with really strong boundaries, and I have these thoughts, but like, I don't want to blow it. The worst thing would be for our relationship to blow up, right? And even the eroticized person, I think that's kind of crap to say they can't, you know, that it's too much in the way because, well, I don't know, maybe for a lot of reasons, but there are people that marry their therapists. Like the Froms ran off together and are these like famous psychoanalysts. And then people just, I guess when it works out and nobody's complaining, it was like not a problem. I don't know. So the erotic versus eroticized. But yes, this person is describing, I think, erotic. But again, you know, erotic, is it sexual? Is it sensual? Is it just intimate? Like, what are we even talking about? But I think the writer, the questioner is talking sexual. And of course, that's the other part that I want to, I guess, empathize with or give validation to is like, it's actually super weird to talk about your sexual fantasies, or not, I mean, socially super weird, right? Like, I don't want anybody to feel like they can't talk about something in therapy, but it's not that common that someone is vulnerable. I mean, I don't know, Dave, you're a man, you tell me about locker room talk, but talking to someone who's not your partner about your sexual fantasies about them really doesn't happen in polite society.
Yeah, you need to be online more. And then I guess that's not polite society though.
Yeah, that's a lawless hellscape. But no, you're not gonna bite on the locker room talk. That's fine.
I'm not taking that one. But
it's a hard thing to talk. It's a hard thing to talk about. Right. It's super hard, especially when it's going to be, well, at least verbally unrequited, right? Or probably it ought to be. If it goes well, it ought to be.
Right. Right. You're setting yourself up for rejection.
Yeah.
If you bring it up. Right. As it should be. But I wanted, so back to the question. So there's a fear of abandonment. So if I bring it up, will I be referred out? And
have you heard of that?
So what I've heard is that if you can't work through it between you and your patient, that one avenue would be not that you stop being the person's doctor, but that you might send them for a consultation so they can work through the erotic transference with another therapist, which that's, to me, that's getting, I mean, I don't know. So yes, I've heard of it. I'm not into it. I have not done that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think consultation is helpful, but to me, the consultation would be that me as a therapist, like I would talk to a supervisor, again, maintaining confidentiality, to figure out how to better work with it. But I guess with my conviction that we're not acting on these feelings, I don't think the patient has to go away unless like it's a true impasse. But it wouldn't be because the person verbalized something or felt something.
Yeah. And I have no idea what will happen for this questioner, but
of
based
course.
on what we were told, I would be shocked if the treatment ended, if there was some referral. I don't know. It just sounds like there's too much
I
to
think it
work
could be
with
really
there.
worthwhile.
Yeah.
There's too much to work with, and that there's a lot here, right? Both in terms of the transference, but also the patient's shame or embarrassment. I think it could deepen their relationship and deepen the treatment. I think they would both probably learn something. But you're right. I mean, I think it's facing rejection, either like in the most extreme form of getting fired or referred out. But there is also that piece, which again, I'm not saying this applies to the letter writer, but that the fantasy, the bubble of the fantasy will be burst. I mean, it sounds like they're not really holding out hope that something would happen, but it may feel like a rejection to pour your heart and soul out about all these feelings you're having. And then the therapist is like, yeah, okay, we're not going to act on that. And depending on their tact, again, they sound wonderful. It's still going to feel like unrequited love.
Yeah.
And that hurts, even if it's ultimately good. I mean, can you give examples? Yes, we'll try. Can it be resolved? I mean, I think the answer is absolutely. Not to say that it's not hard or that it doesn't bring up feelings in the therapist, and maybe that's artificial to try to, save it for later. But there have been many times where I have maybe suspected erotic transference, or that things are a little bit flirtatious. I've had people say things to me like an older man coming in and from the beginning or early on says, well, this is when I was young. I'm so glad to have you, a younger female therapist, because I would like to date somebody like you. So this will be good practice, right? I don't know if that counts because I'm not sure it was so unconscious. I actually, in that case, might argue that actually was a reestablishment of the power dynamic for this person that didn't want to be vulnerable to someone younger than them, maybe let alone a woman. I don't know. But I definitely have had people talk about their fantasies in terms of, could we date? Could we not? And not even as a real question. What would it be like if we could date, right? Or expressing jealousy, because I have a partner, I wear a wedding ring, or the part I was referring to from, in a previous podcast of when I am pregnant, I have had sex with another person. And I think that, consciously or not, brings the subject of sex and my sex life into the room, which maybe stimulated either the transference or brought it to light in terms of that person's place in my life. If I was doing those other things, or wish to have a baby with me, right? I mean, you can go on, and I'm afraid some of it would sound like psychoanalytic mumbo jumbo, but I'm trying to, think of examples when it's been kind of overt and in the room.
Well, so you and I have never, I don't think we've talked about this very explicitly. And so I wondered, I mean, when you ask, like, do I have examples? I mean, part of my response is there's thousands of papers that describe my experience as a man with a female. I mean, that's what that was the normative thing.
Yeah. When I was reviewing for this, part of what frustrated me is how boxed in they were making people's identities, right? Like, as a woman, couldn't I have erotic transference to my female therapist, even if we're both not lesbians or not all the time? Like, I don't know. I mean, I think that people are, most of us are bisexual. I don't know if I have enough of a conviction to say everybody's bisexual. And that I think that these kind of transferences aren't necessarily bound by the physical gender of the person. But maybe these ideas are new enough that there's just not that many papers about non-hetero transferences, or erotic transferences, I should say. I have come across some of like a female patient, female therapist, but it was more like, about mothers and daughters, and that penetrating each other's body was returning to the womb, and right? Like, okay, sure, maybe. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's hard for me to know what kind of concepts are generalizable there.
Yeah. I mean, all
Because,
that early,
and you're right.
no, sorry, I was gonna, all that early literature was just completely heteronormative. And in fact, if they thought that there was a romantic transference between a homosexual patient, the assumption was that the therapist also had to be homosexual. Like there was no conceptualization that it could, So,
that it could go either way. And so, I mean, I guess I will agree with the idea that when I'm bringing this stuff up and I'm saying, well, I've had these experiences and they were overt, I think to your point, that's probably correct, that the times that I'm talking about now were when these men, heterosexual men, assuming I'm heterosexual, or that they're assuming that it was really overt. But in terms of like a truly unconscious erotic transference that is being manifested by some other power play, right? Or some other way of cutting me down, or some other dominant thing. I think most people, at least in my experience, are not super thrilled to have the therapist tell them that they're having sexual feelings about me, right? Whether that makes me a narcissist or a sex fiend. And then, and then we'll talk about that too. And then I think there is a risk, probably regardless of the gender, but I can only speak for myself, of seeming like you're being seductive or flirtatious, right?
Right, by bringing it up.
Because it's like, by bringing it up, I say the wrong thing. It's like, you're having sexual feelings for me. And they're like, well, I'm not, but come to think of it. Like,
do you want me to? Is that
right? Like, is that an invitation? I mean, I don't know. Right. And now I'm stereotyping men, of course, and sort of in the service of humor. But I think that the interpretations around that have to be so careful if it's not like super obvious to the patient. But at least in this question received, I think both parties are aware of it, which to me makes it relatively safe for discussion.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying, and also pretty important.
Well, I was going to, back to the question, can it be resolved? And then maybe I can talk about a personal experience there. I would say, yes, it can, but it really depends on what you mean by resolved. I mean, I think when I've been in the situation, it's talked about, and then the meaning behind it is discussed. So all of the important things happen, but it doesn't mean that the person no longer has any affection for me. It's just that in shining the light on it, the intensity of those feelings tend to diminish. And then usually by the end, it's changed once again. But I guess I just want to set what the expectation is, what is resolved. Like it completely goes away? I don't know, maybe not. But by talking about it, it will get better.
Yeah, and maybe goes away in terms of this all-consuming, super energized focus, right? Like I think that can be resolved. Because I mean, really quickly, because I don't think I said this before, part of the issue is the therapist usually is the one calling it transference, but the experience as a patient is that these are genuine feelings, right? Of, you said affection, but like attraction, love, longing, lust, whatever, that it feels absolutely real. And so if you can look at both the transference reaction, but also the real relationship and because again, there's always a real relationship, the probable real affection and fondness that the two people have for each other, then that counts to me as a resolution, not that you get rid of all good feelings.
Yeah. I also wanted to point out, just in an effort to normalize maybe the experience of the questioner, is it's typical and really expected, and I'm not talking about the erotic transference, but it's expected that your therapist during the treatment starts inhabiting some part of your inner world, to think about the person or to hear their voice during a time of distress or wondering what they would say to you and then saying it to yourself. that usually means things are going really well. And so I guess I just wanted to put that out there too.
Yeah.
Because I think it's off-putting
excellent.
it sometimes. I mean, when people bring it back to the room, it's really helpful to be able to talk about it because it often catches them off guard, and then they get confused about what those, if that's happening, what does that mean about the relationship? And it's like, well, it means that you're finding something useful here, and that as you continue on and improve and you don't need me anymore, you're not going to hear that anymore.
Correct.
Right. And then this last question is going to be the most unsatisfying, I'm afraid. But when you say what could I do to reduce the feelings when they become overwhelming? It's kind of like, we should talk to your therapist about them. I don't know any other advice.
Write them down. Call your favorite podcast.
All right. Well, I hope we answered the question thoroughly enough. And that's helpful. We really appreciate you writing in.
And you know what?
What?
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. What?
I was just going to say, we can talk about it forever. If we didn't answer the question, write back. We'll send you another sticker. Listen, we aim to please. I heard there's no such thing as too long, just too boring. And I'm worried where we're at in terms of which side of the line. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, nobody wants to hear us talk about it more. I'm sure.
What if they want an extensive history? What if they write back and they're like, I want to hear from Dave this time because I want to, a really detailed outline of all the theorists and what they said.
Oh, let's save that for part 2. Thanks for your time, everyone. Keep sending in those questions or topics you want us to cover so we can keep this up. Please tell 5 friends about the show. And we'd love for someone to write a review on the podcast app they're using to listen to the show. We've gotten some reviews. We're extremely appreciative. If someone could write a sentence or 2, that would be even better. You can connect with us on Instagram or Facebook. Those accounts are at Call the Psychiatrist. On Facebook, there's a page, but there's also a private group. And we still have stickers to give out. So if you join the group, send us a message so we can connect and mail you a sticker. And that's the same if you submit a question or complete the email sign up on our website. And speaking of our website, you can leave a voicemail right on the site or send a message at callthepsychiatrist.com. Take care.
Bye. Because he also was like, when you have kids, you're going to want to work part-time and blah, blah, blah. And as you know, maybe I do, but that is not an option for me because he doesn't know about me.
Right.
And he just kept cutting me off and telling me how it was going to be because I was a woman. And it did make me cry. It was horrible.
Wow.
I know.